Genesis 1:1 reads, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." I've said for a long time, I believe that is the most important verse in the Bible. That is how it all gets started. That's how the book of Genesis starts. That's how the Bible starts. But beyond that, that's how faith starts. That's how our approach to inspiration starts. That's how our approach to all things biblical really begins when we accept or do not accept, as the case may be, the idea that God created everything. If you believe that, then you set yourself up for believing the Bible. You set yourself up for believing everything the Bible says. You may not get there, but at least you're on the right track. If you don't get there, if you don't accept Genesis 1:1 for what it actually says, then you set yourself up for failure. I'm not saying that you won't get there. I'm not saying that you can't come to some reason of faith, some reasonable measure of faith. And obviously, God's going to be the one who determines who's a believer and who's not. I'm not suggesting if you don't believe in the six-day creation, you're going to go to hell. I am saying that when you allow yourself to not believe one part of the Bible, you set yourself up for not believing any part of the Bible. And clearly, faith can't exist in an environment like that. This year, we are talking about how we go about building up faith while we're living in a sinful world. That's the theme here at Lakewoods Drive. And this month, we're focusing on beginning things, in the beginning. God is the creator. God is the sustainer. God is the one who promises us who we are and what we can be, etc. And we can, again, either accept him or not accept him on his terms. But when we understand about the creation itself, when we understand about Genesis chapter 1 and 2, we understand what we were planned in the mind of God for in the very beginning. And we come to grips with that, and we embrace that, and we celebrate that. Then in a very real sense, I think we are setting ourselves up for a life that is contented and joyful as we serve him, that is not filled with frustration and anxiety and doubt because we're denying our true nature. Genesis 1:1 tells us what our true nature is. And by accepting that, we set ourselves up for spiritual success. That's my thesis here today. I'd like to share a few thoughts with you with regard to my musings on Genesis chapter 1 and the implications of God creating the heavens and the earth in the beginning. If we embrace the idea of in the beginning, first of all, and most fundamentally, we embrace the idea that God exists. And there are a variety of reasons, but it boils down to basically one, why people don't want to accept that. People don't like the implications of there being a creator God. They don't like the implications of owing our existence to a particular entity with a will and with preferences and with a say and with the power to enforce that say. They would rather live in denial of such things. Now, obviously, because they deny it doesn't mean it's not true, and it doesn't mean that it is true as far as that goes. But let's try not to have our cake and eat it too with regard to creation. If we accept that God created the heavens and the earth, let's start with this basic fundamental principle first, that God is there. This is not some kind of metaphor. This is not some kind of myth that was weaved for us in some faraway culture many centuries ago. This is a testimony to the existence of God. And everything that you read from this verse on forward in the Bible is evidence. And I could get into a big, long discussion about the coherence of the scriptures and how it all ties together, even though written by dozens of different authors over many, many centuries, etc. And we're not going to have time to deal with nearly all of that. What we do want to emphasize, though, is the nature of a person who will reject this for whatever reason. And you can phrase it as anything you want, whether it's education, whether you're talking about bias, immorality, whatever it happens to be. God calls such one a fool, and the word fool is not thrown around casually in the Bible. Psalm 14, verse 1 reads, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. There is no one who does good." And I like the way that the behavior of the godless person is seen as almost necessarily following after the assumption of godlessness. If you don't believe there is a God, corruption is a natural result of that. And this is not the best argument for deism. This is not the best argument for giving your soul to Jesus Christ, because the world is a mess and the world doesn't follow Jesus. And if the world did follow Jesus, then the world would be better off. That's a good argument, I think, but and I think an argument based in reality. Not a compelling argument for a lot of people, obviously, and not the best argument. We can discuss apologetics another time. But I don't think there's any question that the absence of a creator God, the absence of a personality, a power, an entity beyond our understanding, the existence of such a one is a motivating factor with regard to morality. And how could it possibly not be? You have the idea that you are going to be judged and punished or rewarded based on your behavior, versus there is not such a one who's going to pass judgment. There's not such a one who's going to reward or punish. Well, imagine what it would have been like in your parents' house growing up. Imagine what it would have been like in any, on the workplace today, or in school, or whatever authoritarian kind of situation you might want to deal with. The authorities removed and things go haywire. It's just the most natural and, I would argue, inevitable thing that you could imagine. They are corrupt. They have committed abominable deeds. And whether this is because they do not believe in God, or the idea that believing in God would hinder them somehow in their morality, however, whichever one is the chicken, whichever one is the egg, basically it comes down to this basic fundamental thing, that godless people are going to delve into immorality. I mean, God-fearing people do it enough. Let's not give ourselves too much credit here. But if you deny the idea of God, you are denying who you are. You're denying what this world is. And God calls it foolish. That's not my terminology. That's God's terminology. And maybe the foolishness, maybe the ego feeds this idea of there not being any God. We don't want there to be a God. We don't want there to be accountability. And so therefore we convince ourselves that there is no God, that there is no accountability. In other contexts, I think most adults would realize the fallacy of that rationale. It's not appropriate to assume something is true simply because you don't like the consequences of it being true. You don't rationalize that way. You accept things for what they are, and you deal with the consequences. We live in the real world. We live in a reality based on facts, or we used to anyway. That's the way reasonable people behave. That's the way reasonable people have always behaved. And so if we're going to decide on this idea of whether there's a God, let's not reject God simply because we don't like the lifestyle that he's called us to. And he has called us to a lifestyle, by the way. Let's emphasize that. There is a real sense in which we owe God, that we are obligated to serve him. And hopefully you get to a place in your relationship with God where you don't see it as an obligation. You don't see it as a requirement. It's what you want to do. The fool doesn't want to go down that road. And so naturally he's not going to get to the end of that road, unfortunately. It begins with this. It begins with the idea that God did exist, and he still exists. He's still here with us. He is still monitoring things. He is still judging. He is still punishing and rewarding. I know that it doesn't always look that way, but I got a news flash for you. It didn't always look that way in Moses' day, or in Abraham's day, or in Jesus' day. It's never always looked like God was in control. That's where faith comes in. You have to believe that he is there and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek after him. And that kind of goes along with the second point here. God is in the process of working. And this is a big part of the Genesis chapter 1 picture, I think, that God speaks the world into existence. He works for 6 days. He rests on the seventh day. And there is seen in that an allegory. This is the way our week works. That's why we have days cut up into seven, into groups of seven. I don't know what other rationale there would be for that. It comes from the Bible. It comes from the very beginning. God had days grouped in groups of 7. He worked for 6 of them and rested for the 7th. That's the admonition for the people of God in the wilderness, in the land of Canaan. You'd work for 6 days and rest for 7. The implication there is that there is a rest at the end, but first you do the work. And God showed us that in creation, and he shows us that in our own lives. Hebrews talks about the rest that remains for the people of God, chapter 3 of Hebrews. We work until we're done working, and then we enter into the rest. That's the idea. Well, there is a sense, of course, in which God worked for 6 days and he rested on the 7th, and he is done with the creation. But there's also a very real sense in which God is continuing to work, that God is continuing to invest himself emotionally and behaviorally in the affairs of human beings for our welfare. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. But when Philippians chapter 2 verse 3 tells us there, after having told us to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling, verse number 12, the Apostle Paul goes on to say, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. God is working in us by convincing us to work for him. With fear and trembling, we realize the ominous nature of this task, and we set ourselves to this task, and we apply ourselves. And we receive, or should receive at least, I like to think, a great deal of encouragement, a great deal of support when we realize that God is prompting this in us. And I don't think that verse 13 has anything to do with free will. It has anything to do with God forcing us somehow down a particular road that otherwise we would not have chosen. It's the will of God that we work as he worked, that we apply ourselves to this same task. God is trying to provide for us, again, spoiler alert, and we need to be doing the same thing. We need to be applying ourselves for our own spiritual benefit. We need to be working these things out in us. And as we do, as we take in the Word of God, as we apply it to our lives, as we adopt the nature of Jesus day by day, year by year, we try to grow into the image of Jesus Christ, making ourselves a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to the Lord, as Paul puts it in Romans 12, verses 1 and 2. As we do this, we realize that it's not just our own will that we're accomplishing. It is God working through us, trying to get us to the finish line. And of course, we won't get to the finish line in this realm, but he has greater things in mind for us also, which brings up the third point, that God was thinking about human beings from the very beginning. God didn't start to think about human beings, I don't think, in the middle of day 6. I don't think it was God looking around the creation and said, you know what, something's missing here. I wonder what else we could do. Hey, I've got an idea. Let's create man in our image. I don't believe that's what God did. I'm firmly convinced from Genesis chapter 1, as God puts the entire world under man's stewardship, that all of this was done for our benefit. What of the physical realm would be a blessing to God? All these things praise his name, but all things were praising his name already in heavenly realms. How is he advanced? How is his cause advanced? Simply by having another world that he is able to create out of nothing and bring into being, and yes, to a certain degree, absolutely reflecting his glory. That's it, though? Surely it's a much fuller picture when we realize that the world was not created for him, but rather for us. That all of this was to support us. That is why we are given the mandate to fill the earth and subdue it. That is why we are given custody of the planet and what is beyond this planet as well. God, from the very beginning, from before day 1, was thinking about you and me, was thinking about his creation that in terms of time, he had not created yet. And this has some pretty profound implications if you keep carrying this out. If you accept the idea that God knew who we were, that he knew our nature, that he knew that we would let him down, that we would sin in the Garden of Eden, and that we would continue to sin after this, and that he still would want to have us in fellowship with him. Therefore, Jesus would have to die on the cross. That crucifies Jesus before the world was ever created at all. And yet God goes through with this. Why does he do it? Again, that's the love that he has for us. We refer to John 3:16 all the time. Of course, God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. He wouldn't have had to give his only begotten son if he hadn't created us, if he hadn't created the world. But he loved us in prospect. He wanted to love us. And therefore he wanted to bless us. And therefore he gave us this world to live in and all of the marvelous things in it, testifying of himself. The heavens declare the glory of God, the psalmist says. And that hasn't changed either. The idea that God was at one point a thoughtful God, a caring God, a providing God, that necessarily implies that he continues to be such, that he continues to watch over us and love us and provide for us. Romans 8, verse 28 is stitched on a lot of sampler pillows all over the country, and perhaps we don't fully understand the implications of the verse. But when Paul says here that he causes all things to work together for good to those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose, he's not saying there that there is a specific message when your dog gets hit by a truck, or when you lose your job, or when your wife has a miscarriage, or something along those lines. That's not what he's trying to say there. We can tell ourselves a lie and make things worse instead of better by convincing ourselves somehow God wanted these things to happen simply for their own sake. That's not the will of God. That's not what God's purpose is for our lives. When he says all things work together for good, what he's saying is that God never loses sight of the big picture. We do. We constantly do. But God keeps his eyes on the prize, as it were. He keeps his eyes on the finish line. This is not about giving you a good day or a good week or a good new year. I'm sure many of you, I'm sure I also, am praying that 2023 be a good year, that we find the Lord and we find good things in this life, and that maybe the bad things that have been happening to us get a little bit less bad, or maybe go away entirely, whatever it happens to be that you're praying for. However you define a good year and bad year, you're hoping that this year is better than the last year. And that's fine. Nothing wrong with that prayer in the slightest. But understand, that's not how God thinks. God is not hoping that your next year turns out better, that you have more smiles this year than you did last year. I'm not saying God is indifferent to that, but that is not the plan. It's like when your child stubs his toe at age 4. We don't give up hope that their life is over, because right now they're as miserable as they've ever been in their life. We understand the big picture, that this is nothing in the big picture. Likewise, God is using these moments in our life to bring us to his good. And his good is always spiritual. Hopefully you, as a parent, if your child does stub the toe, that you're in position to teach them something in that moment about being careful, perhaps, about choosing their steps more wisely, about medical care or whatever. There are any number of lessons that can be learned in everyday activity. God is teaching us that way. God is working everything, the good news, the bad news, the in-between news, the news for other people, the news for you, all of it is helping you realize who you are and what your life is all about, or what it should be all about. I cannot imagine being in charge of a project like that. I can't even run my own life. Can you imagine a God who is able to do that for every single person who has ever lived on planet Earth? That's who God is. That's what God does. That's what it means when God is thinking of you. He began thinking about you yourself in the very beginning, and he continues to do exactly that and will continue as long as life stands. So the question for us, as we contemplate who God is and what God has always been and what he has always been doing in our lives, if we are going to be willing to humble ourselves before this God, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, the text says in 1 Peter 5, verse 6. That is a task that is too much for most of your neighbors, to be just perfectly blunt about it. Most people look at God, they look at what God expects, and they say, that's not what I want for myself. And so therefore I'm going to chase something else. And if God wants to come along for the ride, that's fine. But in the bottom line, I'm going to do what I want to do. because I'm the most important thing in the universe. And sometimes they'll be honest and tell you about that. If you're a child of God, you must consign yourself to the idea that that is never, ever going to be the case. And that's not just a lack of pride with regard to your neighbors, a lack of arrogance regarding your family members or those who are senior to you or junior to you or whatever. That's part of it, absolutely. But the humility that we show toward one another is all a reflection of the humility that we've already decided to show toward God. If you accept the idea that you're not the greatest one in the universe, then that sets you up to be humble before other people as well. But the greatest arrogance that there is, the greatest arrogance that there could be, is the assertion that I do not answer to God. Maybe there isn't a God at all. And if there is a God, I don't really care. I'm going to do what I want to do all the time, as much as I possibly can anyway. God is calling you to something different. He always has. This arrogance, this lack of humility before God, that's what led to the fall in the first place. That's what caused Cain to kill Abel. That's what doomed the overwhelming majority of humanity to death in the flood in Noah's day, and continues to be punished in Bible times. And we see it, aspects of it, even in our own lives. We see people who think too highly of themselves and pride goes before a fall. We know that to be the case whether we read it in the Bible or not. We do read it in the Bible, though. And since we do that, we find humility. We understand the place that is ours is not the place we have chosen for ourselves, the choice we voted on, the choice that we declared for ourselves in some political arena or business arena or banking institution or whatever. We humble ourselves before God because we realize He is our creator and has been ever since the beginning. And because of that, we owe Him this. And not only do we owe Him this, we embrace the idea of someone greater than ourselves who can, in fact, organize our lives, who can put us on the path that is best for us in this life and in the next life. That's the most fundamental question there is in human existence, whether we will or will not submit ourselves before our Creator. And I hope and pray that you have made a choice to give yourself to God, that you have embraced the idea of being His special creation, that you want that you crave that you want to feel it more in your life, and you're committed to living your life as a child of God for as many days as God happens to give you. Not everyone is up for that. If you are, then God bless you for that, and may God give you strength to continue to grow your faith. But do not lose sight of where it has its roots. Go back and read Genesis 1:1. I don't know if you're in the habit of reading your Bible all the way through every year or whatever, but at least read this verse and read it more than once a year to remind yourself that God did create the heavens and the earth. God did create you, created you in His image. And as such, it is your duty and it is your privilege to live your life in the way that He has designed, that He has intended, and that one day He will reward. Thank you very much for studying along. I hope that this is a blessing to you. Hope that you give yourself to Jesus Christ in the coming year and that you live your life as many days as God gives us in His service. Thank you and God bless.